Hello once again, everybody, and thank you for joining me here on ATS.io radio. This is the Thursday, September 17th edition of our sports betting podcast. I'm joined by professional handicapper Brad Powers from BradPowersSports.com. We'll talk college football week 3. We'll talk NFL week 2. We'll have some highlight topics and games that will turn into videos over on our ATS YouTube page. Lots of stuff going on here today on the program. Lots of stuff going on over at ATS.io as well. We're covering the top sportsbook promotions for the week over there at the website. Some great crowd booster opportunities in Indiana and Illinois for the Colts and the Bears this weekend. But we're also covering all of the sports that are going on with previews, picks, and predictions across Major League Baseball, the NBA, the NHL, the NFL, college football. And we found out that college basketball will be a thing here the day before Thanksgiving, the expected start of the 2020-21 season. So hopefully we do wind up getting that with college basketball. No content on that as of yet over at the website, but I know we'll be covering it as we get closer to the start of the season. And while you're over at ATS.io, check out our sportsbook reviews. If you're in a state that has sports or legal sports betting, you can check out the sportsbook reviews for those. If you're not, well, you can get an idea of what will soon be heading your way as more states adopt legalization here heading into 2021. So like I said, we're going to chat some college football and some NFL here today with Brad Powers from BradPowersSports.com. And Brad, how's it going today, brother?
Man, it's going well. How you doing?
I'm doing well, man. You know, look, football's trying here. I mean, college football is literally giving it the old college try. We do have a couple of games that were postponed this weekend. Houston, Memphis, Charlotte, North Carolina. But Houston has found a way back onto the schedule playing Baylor here. So these teams are being creative. I know Charlotte, erring on the side of caution with contact tracing. Only one positive test, but they opt to postpone their game anyway. At least these schools are trying, and the quest for information on what's happening with these teams just feels never ending right now.
It does. So, bets that you think are good at the start of the week, like North Carolina, because you're betting on news, because Charlotte's quarterback ends up being out. I mean, those bets end up getting voided. So a lot of maneuverability you got to do, but, at least there's football to bet on. So I can't complain too much.
Well, speaking about that, we had some discussions about market entry last week on the shows. Have you gotten more comfortable betting early in the week now with what's happening in college football, or are you still kind of waiting for everything to sort of shake out and for everything to settle in?
Another great question. In some instances, I'm more comfortable, and others I'm not. I'll say this. I was a little more risky this past week jumping into the early circuit numbers. Probably should have backed off a little bit more. I jumped on some totals. I wasn't considering possible weather and whatnot. So that is one change I'm going to make for next week. I'm not going to jump into too many totals early on, but sides, I'm ready to go. I'm pretty comfortable when it comes to that.
Well, and that was a discussion that we had on Monday with fellow professional handicapper Kyle Hunter about, is it worth jumping in there to try and get some of this perceived line value in the event that maybe by Wednesday or Thursday, some bad news breaks? We kind of talked about it more in the context of the NFL, where numbers are extremely important, especially key numbers. In college football, we all want to get out in front of the market because the size of the moves is sometimes quite significant, 4, 5, 6 points, things like that. Do you feel like it's worth that risk if you think you've got, a pretty good number on Monday to fire away?
Yeah, I mean, especially if the expectation is it's going to move several points. Maybe I'm not jumping on the around a key number. I'm taking 7.5 like I did a couple, years ago and taking 3.5 because I know it's going to move in that direction. Those are the type of bets I'm kind of laying off. But certainly if I expect that if the number's off 4 or 5 points, and that does still happen in college football, then I'm firing away.
Well, one of the things that was very important to find out here in week 2 is to see some of these teams. I mean, we saw a handful of teams in week 1. We saw a lot more teams in week 2. Including some of the heavier hitters, teams in the ACC, a team like Notre Dame, stuff like that. So from week 2 to week 3 here, Brad, what were some of the biggest power ratings adjustments that you made on some of these teams?
Great question. So when you look, Notre Dame, what wasn't to me a major upgrade or downgrade. If you listen to people on Twitter watching the game, you would have thought Notre Dame played absolutely horribly. I didn't have that take. I just thought they were rusty early in the game, and I'm very anti Notre Dame when it comes to betting and gambling. So only about a point or so movement there, but some of the biggest ones that I've had to adjust so far. Obviously Army continues to get a major upgrade. I mean, not only from the first game performance, but market was all over Army in that game against ULM last week. And I upgraded Army another couple of points. So, I mean, I got Army up almost a touchdown for 6 points since the start of the season. And I was high on them to begin with. That's my biggest adjustment so far. Georgia Southern not having 30 players. I think you got to take them down about a touchdown. So that would be on the lower end, Georgia Southern taking them down.
Yeah, I took Army up 5 points last week. I didn't make an adjustment after their week 1 game. Wound up making an adjustment after week 2, moving them up 5 points. So you and I both in the same place there. I didn't know what to do with Georgia Southern for this week. I only moved them down 5, but obviously an interesting situation here where FAU this week has some COVID concerns. So, it's very tough to power rate really both of those teams at this point in time. But what about some of the bigger names, some of the ACC teams that we saw in action? Miami looked pretty good with De'Ara King. Florida State looked awful, a continuation of what we've seen from them here over the last few years in Tallahassee. What about some of those ACC moves? Anything really noteworthy there?
Yeah, I took down Florida State 3 points. Maybe not enough. I mean, I bet Georgia Tech, and I already had like a 2-3 point overlay in that game to begin with. So that's why I wasn't aggressive downgrading Florida State. I thought Georgia Tech clearly was the superior team. My numbers on Georgia Tech all preseason have been very high on the Yellow Jackets. So not huge adjustments there. I did bump up Miami a couple of points, finally seeing, a quarterback in that system making plays. Maybe not significant upgrade there, but the other upgrades, Clemson, I left the same. Wake Forest, I upgraded about a point. Are you hearing the commotion I'm dealing with right now?
I am. I'm hearing the commotion there. You got the cat in the background, and Brad Powers has left the show here for a minute to let the cat out of the proverbial bag here. Let the cat out of it. But then you leave the door open, so the damn thing's going to come back.
Well, have you heard him pounding on the door? He can open a door, so we'll see.
That's all right. That's fine. It happens. Whatever. Look, I mean, it's one of those things here with the ACC in that you sort of wonder how these teams will look if they hit the ground running, if they have sort of that transition period. And, we don't really know what some of those teams will look like this week. We don't know what the SEC will look like next weekend, although all of us are very excited to have another major conference back. You mentioned with the Florida State movement that you already had the line off market a little bit, on the Georgia Tech side. And I agreed with you. I had my number in the same range that you did, both of us on Georgia Tech last week, and that wound up coming to fruition. So I think it's an important lesson for our listeners here, and I want to spend a couple of minutes on this with regards to power ratings adjustments, where when you're already off market, that sort of dictates the adjustment that you actually make.
Yeah, it does. So maybe not as aggressive. I mean, it's more about the market coming towards where your number was. So again, typically if I'd have saw that performance out of Georgia Tech and, just saying my power ratings was close to that line going into it, maybe I upgrade them 3-4 points, downgrade Florida State 4-5 points or whatnot. To me, whenever the game result ends up, going along kind of where I'm at, obviously the amount of adjustments just not there. I don't automatically just change it along with everybody else. It's smaller changes for me. The market's starting to come where I'm at on that particular team.
All right, so we got one of our highlight topics here for this Thursday edition of ATS.io radio. And Brett, I wanted to talk about handicapping coaches in college football because, in the NFL, there are obviously some very good coaches, some coaches that are below average, and some guys that we would all say are pretty bad. But much like a power ratings gap from 1 to 32 in the NFL, the gap between coaches isn't as significant, I would say, as it is in college football. So first, before we talk about some specific examples here that you've taken advantage of in this 2020 season, how do you handicap coaches? I mean, how do you quantify coaches that are better than others, or do you just sort of file it away in the back of your mind and use it maybe as justification for a play more than having some sort of actual statistical analysis of the coaches?
Well, coaches goes into my team power rating. I have a specific column for coaches, and obviously, big difference between a Nick Saban and a first-year coach. I always use the example Mike Jinks from Bowling Green from a few years ago. Big difference there. So it goes into the overall team power rating. Now, specifically to this year, when it came to first-year coaches, even if I really like the hire, I wasn't big on upgrading that team from a coaching aspect. Say for example, Florida State, Mike Norvell, who I think is an upgrade over Willie Taggart from last year. Normally, hey, even though he's a first-year coach, upgrade at the coaching spot for that particular category in my power rating. Not the case this year because of the disadvantages specifically to COVID. At least my theory was first-year coaches were going to be really behind the eight ball, no spring practices, less actual face-to-face time with your actual players. So I wasn't anxious to bet a lot of first-year coaches, at least the first couple weeks of the season. Thankfully, that theory's proven to be correct. I mean, first-year coaches so far, FBS, FCS, since we're dealing with a lot of those FCS teams playing FBS games, I mean, first-year coaches now are 2-8 against the number.
Well, and how long do you expect that to last? I mean, how long do you give these coaches, seeing their teams in action and then having that week of practice? I mean, do you think that this is something that just carries over all the way through 2020, not having spring practices, having kind of the weird camps and lead up to the season and all that? Or do you expect some of these first-year coaches to make, the necessary adjustments with their teams and get them into a better spot?
Another great question. Typically, maybe I only use it first couple weeks of the season in normal season. Maybe it's an extra week this year. Or, I mean, case-by-case basis, we'll see. Maybe some just won't figure it out. The beauty of this year is we have a staggered schedule. So as some of those first-year coaches start to make those adjustments, the second game, third game, fourth game, whatnot, we get, ramp up. SEC is going to be playing next week with 4 new coaches. Big Ten's going to have new coaches here in October. So the beauty of it is, it might last all year long where I'm playing against first-year coaches just because of a staggered schedule.
Now, I think when we say coaches, people assume that we just mean head coaches. But to me, I really love handicapping the coordinators. That's one of my favorite things to do in the lead up to a college football season. Didn't do as much of that as I typically do because I didn't really expect college football to be played. Didn't want to put in the time. Like I mentioned before, I put in a ton of time in the MLB betting guide back in February. And then, of course, that kind of went up in flames a little bit. So what about coordinators? How do you sort of factor them into this equation?
Depends on how drastic the scheme change is. Although I'll say this, Syracuse had a dramatic scheme change to a 3-3-5, and I thought their defense against North Carolina looked pretty legit last week. So, I mean, theoretically, I would say if you have a drastic scheme change, big time negative. Didn't have time to install that scheme. Didn't have spring practices to actual practice and play on that scheme. So typically while I could do some major upgrades, downgrades, first year coordinators, I'm kind of wait and see right now. I don't have enough data points to make, I think, concrete conclusions.
I think two of the biggest things regarding coordinators are, especially offensive coordinators in particular, when you go to a different kind of tempo, I think that's something where you can find a lot of betting value out there in the marketplace because we have this expectation. You think about a team like Miami, for example, going to Rhett Lashley. We have this expectation that they're going to play faster. And maybe the totals market will adjust. Maybe the totals market won't. But that's something, especially at the group of 5 level. If you get an offensive coordinator, that maybe you're going from a pro style to a spread style with some more tempo, something like that. I think those are things that the market is pretty slow to react on. I hate to put you on the spot here, but off the top of your head, can you think of any teams right now that have had substantial, or that you expect to have substantial tempo changes here from what they were last year?
Well, I can tell you right now, your example, Miami's dead on. I mean, we've seen Miami's totals take money now 2 weeks, and you really never, fully know until you see the market making some dramatic changes. But we've seen that from Miami, group of 5 level, Texas State for me. And actually 2 teams that played last week, and we saw the total go way over, but we really didn't see a market movement because of COVID issues on both UTSA and Texas State. Spavital at Texas State, he's the head coach. He actually took over the play calling duties. That's where he made his hay. I expect Texas State's offense all year long to be dramatically improved from last year. And UTSA, what we saw was them go from Frank Wilson, a defensive-minded type of coach, to an offensive-minded coach in Traylor. We saw that offense come out, even though limited practice time, first-year coach. I mean, that was the best offensive performance UTSA's had in several years. So those would be two they just played. But I'm not sure. The problem is 51-48. Now people saw that final score, and they're going to be all over it. But I still would, if you tell me blindly play the over on Texas State and UTSA games this year, I think you'll be positive, EV.
Yeah, I watched a good bit of that UTSA-Texas State game, in part because it was such a fascinating game, especially in the second half with UTSA blowing that lead. But they ran the football very effectively. And I like the idea, if you're a really bad team, and I've talked about this before, and I've talked about, maybe some of the teams that are bad in power conferences, maybe trying something like the option. Before Matt Campbell got to Iowa State, I thought, what do you have to lose? At least you get some kind of recruiting advantage if you start running an offense nobody else is running, because you can recruit for that at the high school level. It gives you a chance to pull a Georgia Tech and go 7-6 or 8-4 every year, something like that, just because you do something different. I think that's something with the really bad teams. What you've been doing doesn't work. So why the hell not try something dramatically different? And even though UTSA gave up a ton of points last week, I upgraded them 3.5 points in my power ratings because I went, this team has an offense now. They're not going to lose these games 24-7, 31-10. They may be bad, but at least they're going to push things offensively. And I respect that, and I appreciate that. And other teams now have to make an adjustment to UTSA. So that's another element of coaching here that's maybe not quantifiable until you see it. But to me, I think these teams that do something more exciting, I think it does encourage me to either want to play on them or at least value them a little bit higher.
Yeah, I mean, in a normal season, I would be all about offense as a group of five. I mean, it's sell tickets in a normal season. And how do you do that? I mean, you go offense, you explosive plays, score some points, and make it exciting football. One that did come to mind, and I don't know if it's going to play out this week against you look at Western Kentucky. Liberty is talking about going super fast. That's all I read all off season long. I'm not sure the first game's the way to play it. I did play it at Circa. Marcus disagreed with me in this one, but I think Liberty, even though they're replacing all-time leading passer, all-time leading receiver for them, all their talk has been up-tempo, up-tempo, up-tempo. Keep an eye on Liberty here in the next couple of games.
Well, again, I think it's definitely very important for us to use these highlight videos on our ATS YouTube page to talk about these different betting concepts and certainly to have them here on ATS.io radio as well. So, I guess we'll sort of talk about that Liberty game for a minute here. Give us a couple of minutes to, transition into the next highlight video here. That's such an intriguing one because I know you're big on returning production, especially early on in the season. And Liberty has virtually none of it. They lose their quarterback. They lose a 1,000-yard rusher. They lose an NFL draft pick in Gandy Golden. I don't know if Malik Wilson has officially been named the starter. You can tell me that. But, going with more of an up-tempo style, is this a good thing for them? Those are questions that we have to ask as we sort of try to figure out where these teams are going into their first games.
Yeah, the expectation is going to be Willis. You're right. I haven't seen official, he's going to be QB1 for Liberty, but all intents and purposes, he's going to be that quarterback, although they did bring in a transfer from Maine there to maybe if Willis didn't have it, he's got at least some experience. So you're right. And not only did you mention the returning production, major edge for Western Kentucky, but also game under your belt advantage for Western Kentucky. The fact that they actually played a game, although they didn't look very good against Louisville last week, I think that's another, I would say point in their direction. Although pure power rating for me is on the game almost right near the number. I did not, other than making an early bet on the over, which the market disagrees with me, I didn't bet the side on this one. And even at the current number, right around 14, I think it's a fair number.
By my count, and I could be off here, I think, of the FBS versus FBS games that are on the schedule here this week, I believe 8 of them feature a team that's played a game against a team that hasn't played a game. And I think as you look up and down the betting board here, that's priced into the number. I think NC State would be bigger than 2.5 against Wake Forest. I think Central Florida would be bigger than 7.5 against Georgia Tech. I think the Duke line is a little bit too big at 6 against Boston College. Because these teams have played a game, we've seen them, we've got that data point. What did you do, as a general rule, with those games here this week where, yeah, we've seen a team and we have an idea of how they may look, but the lines are probably, sort of pricing that in maybe a little bit too much?
Maybe into an overall, I have my pure power rating. That's just the strength of the team. So, game under belt, all that stuff doesn't go into my pure power rating on a game. When I'm doing a handicap, then, I give a team an extra point or so. To me, it looks like the market's overreacted to that point. Specifically, I wanted to bet, after I watched Notre Dame Duke, I wanted to bet Duke against Boston College. I expected the number. Maybe it's 3, maybe it's 4. I mean, it's 5.5, 6. Baked way too much in the line, the fact that Duke has a game under their belt advantage. And I know you used to have him on a ton, Ralph Michaels from Cal Sports. He actually queried this up in this offseason because the expectation was you're going to have some game under belt situations this year. It's a negative, long-term negative. We're talking going back 20 years, it's like 45% if you're betting on the team with the game under belt advantage versus the team with no game under their belt. So my guess is fully baked into the number. And if you do want to play on these teams with games under their belt, because we're going to see it here for the next still month or so, teams with disproportionate amount of advantages, I think bet it early. If you want to bet on the team with the game under their belt, bet it early because the market's going to overreact throughout the course of the week.
And that's what it seems like. It does seem like an overreaction based on, Ralph Michaels running that query. And, that was something that kind of jumped off the page to me and something that I think was, it's hard because we talk about our power ratings and, there are some games where I do kind of have some discrepancies here, but I don't want to play them maybe for that reason because you've got a situation where a team has played and a team hasn't, especially Boston College. I think my line on that game, I can actually bring it up here. My line on that game, I believe, is 4, or it's actually 2.5 with Duke favored, which is where I think that game should be. But you also have a situation here, first-year head coach in Jeff Hafley at Boston College. So, you've got power ratings overlay based on the market number, but you've got this angle that we already talked about where first-year head coaches 2-8 ATS. Yeah, I've got line value. I've got line value through key numbers too, and I can't play it. And that's a little bit frustrating. I mean, that being said, if this goes up to 6.5 or 7 based on public action on Duke, I may have to fire on Boston College here out of principle. But it's a tough situation to be in with already a lot of uncertainty thanks to COVID to begin with.
No doubt. I mean, if it's typical normal season, Boston College +6 would be in pocket for me. Right now, just too many unknowns. Not only, you talk about the new head coach for Boston College, limited spring practice time, and also brand new quarterback, a transfer quarterback, wasn't even in the program, Phil Dracovic from Notre Dame, who I'm not necessarily high on. Market seems to love this kid. I watched him spring games. I watched him play against Bowling Green last year. I don't think the kid's that great, but we'll see in a new system. So too many unknowns right now. Do I expect maybe to be playing more on these types of situations as we move along? Yeah, we're week 3 and we're still only 20 some games in the season. Remember, typically week 1 with all the FCS games, I mean, I've been writing up all the games. Typically week 1 is like 80 some games each week. Each year. So far, we've only had like 20 games. Too small a sample size to say whether there's value in some of these.
All right, there is a game I want to ask you about here, and then we'll get to a highlight game and then sort of scroll around the card a little bit. But game 119-120 is Syracuse and Pitt. And this is one where I've got an overlay. I mean, my number in this game is 15. But I am not in any rush to go and bet Syracuse after how bad they looked last week. Meanwhile, Pitt handled Austin Peay on FCS team there. I tell you what, man, 21.5 is a big number here, especially with a total of 50, which implies that, Syracuse will do nothing offensively again. That could be true, but as you just said, their defense, and in particular with that new 3-3-5 scheme, which is kind of a tough thing to play against. Some teams in the Mountain West have had great success with a 3-3-5, kind of confounding their opponents a little bit. I just want to get your thoughts on this one, because like I said, this is probably my biggest power ratings overlay of the week.
Yeah, I got an overlay too, not as big as yours. I got an 18.5. I mean, even though Syracuse is right there, I mean, it took a 21-0 fourth quarter for North Carolina to cover the number last week. So I still downgraded the orange couple of points in my power ranks. that typically wouldn't be the case. But market wise guys hate Syracuse. They love Pitt this year. I don't know what we can really take away from that Austin P game other than, I mean, they crushed them, and bad beat for anybody that bet Pitt with the no action on the 10-minute quarters in the second half. They get 4 of their key guys back. They didn't have 4 key starters for that game and still dominated. So I still upgraded Pitt a couple of points there. Still got a big overlay. And my number one season win total bet was under Syracuse, and it seems like the market still is way lower on Syracuse than I am. And I think it's a horrific mismatch. Their offensive line against Pitt's defensive line, one of the better defensive lines in the country. So even though it's going to sound like a broken record, I got a 3-point overlay. Typical season, I am firing away on the orange plus 21.5 right around the key number this year. Nah, I'm just not interested.
I remember the Pitt-Syracuse game last year because I remember that, I was on Pitt in that game. I think we had them as a contest play in the Golden Nugget. And I'm watching that game at Chicago Midway Airport. And I was just getting so pissed off that Pitt they wouldn't put any distance in that game. I think they had like 8 or 9 sacks in that game. They beat the hell out of the Syracuse quarterback. They just never put any distance in that game. And again, I'm cherry picking one example, but
now that's Narduzzi. You want to lay 3 touchdowns with Pat Narduzzi?
Exactly.
Get the hell out of here.
That's where I was going with that. Is some teams just aren't capable or just aren't prone to blowing out the opposition when they need to. And that's something that, again, maybe it's anecdotal, but also when you talk about the process of handicapping coaches, it's something that stands out. It's something that I remember that Pitt, for whatever reason, just seems to let teams hang around.
They do. And typically it's been a stagnant offense for them. Although, their defense has also struggled in past years. That's not the issue this year. And maybe they push some tempo. They even mentioned it in the recap of the Austin P game. I mean, if you looked at Pitt historically, they had struggled those season openers against FCS teams. But Narduzzi did make an emphasis. He said, hey, we're going to push it a little bit. So maybe that's not Pittsburgh this year. Although I'm going to use the last 5-6 years of sample size to say that specifically in a conference game, I am not really anxious to bet the Panthers minus 21.5. Just ain't happening for me.
An interesting game here on the board, and this will be one of our highlight games for our ATS YouTube page. Game 121-122 is Appalachian State and Marshall. App State up to 4.5 now total on this game in the 59.5 range. This is an interesting one because we have a scenario here where, App State, as we talked about last week, one of the 2 teams with an altitude advantage here with the Mountain West and the Pac-12 not playing. Boone, North Carolina, very, very high in elevation as far as, teams east of the Mississippi go. UTEP, the other one down in El Paso. Now they're on the road in Huntington, West Virginia to take on a Marshall team that is generally very, very well coached. And App State, one of those teams with a first-year head coach in Sean Clark, and we've talked about that a lot already here on the podcast version of ATS.io radio. What do you think about this one here, Brad, between App State and Marshall?
Pure power rating for me is 5.5. I upgraded Marshall significantly, 3 points from the Eastern Kentucky performance, although I think Eastern Kentucky is just a terrible team. I think that's been proven now the first couple games of the season. And I think most of the upgrade didn't have to do with any part of the team other than the quarterback. Grant Wells looked the part, threw the ball down the field. I don't care if you got open receivers. To be able to throw it, on a line 40, 50 yards down the field several times in that game against Eastern Kentucky, I upgraded Marshall. App State, I bet against App State. I liked Charlotte last week. Bet Charlotte early in the week and a much better number than where it closed at 16.5. And I was not impressed whatsoever with Charlotte. I thought I had to hang on for dear life, even though Charlotte was only down 1 point late third quarter in that game. Didn't feel necessarily comfortable with my bet. I want to bet against App State, and I upgraded App State's power rating. They had a couple rushers go for 100 yards. They gave up a kick return touchdown. They fumbled on the 1 yard line. They probably should have easily covered that game against Charlotte. A Charlotte team that went to a bowl game last year. App State had 11 spring practices. And even though they got a first-year coach, there's still some continuity. He was there in the program. His new defensive coordinator was in the program for several years prior to taking last year off with another program. So there's more continuity at App State than most. You got the quarterback, Zach Taylor, a multiple-year starter. I like App State here at the 4.5 number. They're the more proven commodity for me. other than upgrading Marshall, I still don't know much. 0 spring practices, and they played an average FCS team at best. More comfortable with the Mounties here.
Yeah, I thought it's a really interesting handicap. And like you, my number's a little bit higher than the market. I've got 6 on this one. Couple of talking points I want to expand on a little bit more here. For Marshall, they play a game, then they have a week off. Now they play again. And we talked earlier in the show about teams that are playing their first games here and not really being sure what we're going to get out of them. We got a couple of teams here, Navy being one of them this week with a long layoff, and then also Marshall. What do you think about that, where you don't get the spring practices, you've got this weird lead up to the season, you play a game, and you want to get into rhythm. You want to get all the timing down and all of that. You play a game, then you have a bye week. Now you play again against one of the best group of 5 schools in the country year in and year out. Do you think it helps Marshall that they got to play and then have a week off to work on things, or do you think it hurts them because you kind of strive for that consistency early in the year?
Yeah, I think in Marshall's case, and I think Navy's a completely different example, but Marshall's instance, I think it's a negative for them. I think I would have rather seen them, play game after game, get more consistency because they hadn't had any spring practices. So to me, I think, it's not a major negative. It's not like I moved, the game a point or so, but to me, it's not positive, EV.
What about the total here? Total moving up from 57 to 59, 59 and a half. And as you said, from watching Marshall in their first game, a little bit more of a vertical nature to that passing attack. But, we think about App State, they're always very good defensively. They're not really a big pass play offense. They run the football very well. Thomas takes care of the football. This total feel like it's getting a little bit high to you?
It does a little bit. So I had it in the 57, 58 range is where I power rated it at. So continues to climb for me, would lean under. And look, it's a big game. Maybe there's some nerves. I mean, this is a 3:30 CBS game now. And I think that would have been a major advantage for Marshall had they been able to sell out their stadium and stuff and have a 3:30 CBS time slot. Not so much with limited crowd attendance for them, even though they had some fans for Eastern Kentucky. Maybe some added pressure with the national spotlight. To me, when you have added pressure, I don't want to be, betting blindly on an over.
Well, it's not the strongest of consensus plays for us here, but both Brad and I do like Appalachian State here. It's better at 3.5, at 4.5. It's a little bit closer to the power ratings numbers that we both have. But we wanted to break down this highlight game for you here on our ATS YouTube page and encourage you every Monday and Thursday, Tuesdays as well now with Brian Blessing, to check out our ATS.io radio content. As we look at the rest of the board here, Brad, any other games that kind of stand out to you? Further down, we got Louisiana Tech. They're playing their first game against the Southern Miss team in that same situation as Marshall, not to mention with a new head coach. Texas State back at it, laying a massive number on the road for them against UL Monroe, 5.5. I think Texas State's been favored on the road. I guess the first time since November 2014, I want to say, that they're favored on the road. Right. And any of these other games stand out to you here at the bottom of the board?
Well, I think you hit on 2 of them. I mean, I do like Southern Miss, and typically maybe I wouldn't, but I think they get a 1-game bump with an interim. They got a 30-year-old coach, very high energy. He's already been a head coach before, I know at the D3 level, but they were the highest scoring offense in the entire country in this 1 year as a head coach. And if you listen to his quotes, he's talking about pushing the tempo, the pace, not letting their foot off the gas pedal. And upon further reflection, I mean, maybe South Alabama, the team who upset Southern Miss, maybe they're not such a bad football team. I mean, they were handling Tulane with a backup quarterback for a majority of the game, could have beaten Tulane outright as a double-digit underdog. So maybe we shouldn't have downgraded Southern Miss as much. From everything that I've read, Jay Hobson, the former coach, there was not a good relationship between him and necessarily the players. Remember, Hobson wanted to, hire Art Briles. I think that really affected the chemistry overall on that team. So I didn't majorly downgrade Southern Miss from a head coaching aspect, even though I typically would. And Louisiana Tech, I mean, who knows? I mean, it's baked into the number, but I don't think it probably isn't baked in enough. They had 38 players out last week. Didn't practice because of COVID. I don't care if all those players are back this week for them. They missed a whole week of practice, leading up to the season. Game under their belt, new exciting young head coach. Southern Miss for me, -5, I think it's a good bet.
One other game I want to ask you about here, UCF hasn't played yet. They're favored over Georgia Tech. That makes sense. UCF again, one of the best group of 5 schools year in and year out. Troy and Middle Tennessee State is a fascinating line to me. You've got Troy minus 3.5, total 64.5 in this game. I've got MTSU favored by a half point in my power ratings. But, when you think about the first data point for MTSU, it probably couldn't have been much worse. On the other hand, they're playing an option team. Yep. They don't see the option much. And quite frankly, they probably didn't care to defend the option because it was a one-off sample, and they're more worried about getting their team together. Not a great showing from Rick Stockstill. I know you talked about that on your Twitter page at Brad Powers and the number 7. Look, I like Troy. I like this program a lot. Year in and year out, they're very consistent. They're very good. 3.5 feels big to me, though.
It does. I got 6.5 at Circa. So I'm with you. Initial thoughts were, Middle Tennessee for me. Still would lean Middle Tennessee plus the 3.5. I think it's a pretty good bet. What concerns me a little bit, more reading that I've done throughout the week, is Middle Tennessee had 4 starters get hurt in that Army game. Doesn't look like any of them are back this week. So, and not skill position guys or anything like that, but at the line of scrimmage. So negative there. Game under their belt. I think you can throw some of that result out because they were so ill-equipped to play the option. So I think the market downgraded Middle Tennessee a little too much. Pure number for me was like 2.5 Troy. So, of course, threw a key number. I'm comfortable even at this point, even with those starters out. Middle Tennessee plus 3.5 would be the play for me.
I guess help our listeners out a little bit here, and I apologize if this takes away some of your edge, but where do you find college football injury information? Because it's generally not easy to find.
Boy, tough. I mean, Twitter probably is the best. I mean, go team by team.
It's the only thing that Twitter is good for.
Yeah, I mean, that's a shame because then, it takes me, 90% of the time is scrolling through political crap that I don't want to see. I mean, so what I've done is specifically, I've had time to do this year. I've created college football lists, whether it be beat reporters for specific teams, specifically if they're not into the political garbage, they're just reporting and doing their job on their team. I followed a lot of those guys. That's probably the best. I mean, generically speaking, Don Best injury reports. I mean, they're okay. I mean, stuff that I read in newspaper articles generally appears on their site. So if you're doing basic 101, Don Best injuries is okay.
All right, so let's transition over to the NFL side of things here for a good little bit on today's show. And we talked about this a lot on Tuesday with Brian Blessing. We did some videos, and we also did an ATS.io radio show. Week 1 to week 2, it's overreaction week in the NFL. We've seen several of them. We've seen some lines move against the initial overreaction. We've seen some lines keep going with the overreaction. Just as a starting point here, we are going to go a little more in detail with a highlight video on Ravens and Texans here in a little bit. But what are some of the overreactions that stand out to you here for week 2?
Oh, wow. One of them might actually be, I know we're taping this on Thursday, but the Browns-Bengals game. I think maybe a little bit overreaction on the Browns getting crushed. I mean, that's what the Browns do. They lose season openers. And a number that pretty much has come down through a key number from the look-ahead line here. Cincinnati looked okay. I mean, but they basically met expectation. We're 3-point the underdog, lost by 3 in that game. And, fourth quarter, the case could be made that they could easily forced overtime in that one. But I think that one seems a little bit like an overreaction to me just because the spot is so horrible for Cincinnati. You and I talked before we taped here. Seems like an overreaction to me, although I'm not running to the window or, fired up my app to go ahead and bet Cleveland tonight. That's one that stood out to me a little bit.
Yeah, I think maybe if this one comes off 6, I might take a shot with Cleveland, but I'm also a jaded Browns fan who always comes to expect the worst. So, Joe Burrow could very well look like Russell Wilson tonight. It wouldn't surprise me at all because those are the things that happen to the Cleveland Browns, and I will continue supporting the Browns, but doesn't mean I have to support them with my hard-earned money by going ahead and betting on them. Any other games here for Sunday that you're kind of looking at going, this line just it doesn't really look right. Good doesn't really look right to me.
Well, a couple of them. I would say the Detroit-Chicago game, probably a little overreaction what happened in the fourth quarter. I mean, Detroit was clearly the better team. So to me, I kind of want to play against the Bears, even though I'm not wild about the Giants. And I kind of want to play on the Lions against the Packers. Those were kind of a point. And we just got done talking, hey, my overlay in this college game is 3 points. I'm not betting it. Hell, in the NFL, if I think I got a half-point advantage, I mean, most of the time in most seasons, I'm betting a half-point advantage in the NFL because the lines are so tight. One in particular to me is very interesting. Minnesota, who I took plus the full field goal here. I get it, Indianapolis dominated the box score, but to me, it just reminded me of 15 years of San Diego and LA Chargers football under Phillip Rivers. Dominate the box score, look the part, except on the scoreboard. I can't trust the Colts team, specifically with out any fans. This number is saying the Colts by and far are the better team than Minnesota. I get it. The Vikings defense looked like garbage against Aaron Rodgers last week, but my goodness, I thought Minnesota +3 looked pretty good to me, and I bet the Vikings off that 3 number.
Now, the one thing I would say, and I kind of posed this question on Tuesday to Brian, so I'll pose it to you as well. Yeah, you get the week 1 to week 2 overreaction. You do get, some of these line adjustments out there in the marketplace. Now, my devil's advocate point of view here would be we didn't have the preseason. We had limited OTAs. How much can things really change in 1 week in the NFL with some of these teams? So I guess that's kind of my, caveat, asterisk, whatever you want to call it. That's something that I'm kind of trying to weigh here, thinking about my Circa card that I'm going to have for this weekend.
How'd you do in the Circa?
4-0-1 last week.
That's good.
But I got fortunate, man. The Chargers shouldn't have covered. Denver probably shouldn't have covered. Chargers pushed. The Broncos shouldn't have covered. I got lucky, but you got to get lucky in a contest like that from time to time. But, yeah, it's a great start. I'm very happy with it. But like I said, I'm trying to weigh that risk reward here going into this, or not the risk reward, but just sort of that whole thought process of, it's an overreaction, but do we just see more of the same in week 2?
That's a great point. That's why I love doing this. I didn't think of that because typically, normal standard procedure, week Tuesday, like we've been talking about, the biggest overreaction week of the entire year. I'll be perfectly frank. I haven't, to me, at least from I'm looking at the board, I haven't seen major overreactions like I typically do. I think maybe the money shows up. Obviously limits get opened up later in the week, and then we start to see some reactions. Maybe we see them. Right now, to me, it's kind of wait and see. I've never handicapped a COVID season before. So in some instances, I think it's easier. In this instance, I'm not sure with the NFL card.
It makes me sort of wonder here, maybe not even just this year, but maybe going forward, maybe week 3 is the new week 2, because then we've got 2 data points and you get all those stats that are out there of, 7 teams that have started 0-2 have made the playoffs or whatever the hell the stat is. I'm just, throwing that off the top of my head, but you always get that. Well, this team can't go to 0-3. If they go 0-3, they're not going to make the playoffs. Maybe week 3 is the new week 2, because it's ingrained in us now from all the betting content and all the shows that are out there that week 2 is the overreaction week. Odds makers are going to adjust the same way that we are. Maybe week 3, maybe next week is the week that you and I reconvene and we go, oh shit, there's a lot of overreaction on the board here.
Maybe that's the case. So I get it. 40 is the new 30 and that, although I'm ever approaching 40, 40 is not the new 30. So week 3, week 2, I don't know.
Yeah.
It could be. Although, generally speaking, I normally see 2-3 points of overreaction, in my opinion, in week 2. Generally speaking, I'm not seeing it this year.
No, I think maybe more so on totals. We're seeing a little bit of overreaction, I think, this week. But from a side standpoint, there's not a ton. I thought initially, and I talked about this on Monday, and I talked about it on Tuesday, I thought initially that maybe Buffalo and Miami was a little bit of an overreaction, just because I think New England's actually still a very good football team, even though a lot of people don't think that. But the more I kind of look at this number, and I still like Miami, and I probably will still go contrarian and take them in the Circa, maybe that number's not wrong. I don't know. But like you said, it doesn't seem like there are a lot of games here this week where it just feels wildly inaccurate. And maybe part of that is because we're all still trying to figure out what the hell's going on with this league and with these teams and, with the very unique lead up to the season. But, again, too, look, you didn't have to prepare for any preseason games as a head coach. When you got together for practice, you worried about your team and you had multiple weeks to worry about that first week 1 opponent. What happens now this week where you've got your traditional 4, 5, 6 days to prep for your week 2 opponent? Last week, it was almost all division games. This week it's not. So, I mean, there are still a lot of them, but this week it's not. And, some coaches don't do well going outside the division. Some teams play better against teams that aren't familiar with them. Maybe those are more the angles that we need to be looking at.
Absolutely. And one thing I will say, maybe we haven't seen too much of an overreaction. Do you know of anybody that lost last weekend as far as NFL Week 1? At least guys that do it professionally. All the theories that we had, all the plays, all the stuff that was obvious to the guys that do it professionally, all won. I mean, everybody had not just win. I mean, you went 4-0-1 in the Circa. My newsletter picks went 3-0. I mean, everything that you played won. So we didn't have a lot. I mean, basically met expectation. So we didn't have a lot of outliers as far as finals like we typically do in Week 1. Maybe that's not why we're seeing hardly anything in Week 2. But maybe this is the new, like you said, this is maybe the new Week 1 because we're not seeing those familiarity foes and whatnot. And maybe we'll be talking next week about a lot of overreactions, hopefully, because overreactions means value.
Maybe this Week 2 is Week 1, and people thought last week was the preseason. I heard people kind of talking about that, too, of, I'm treating Week 1 of the NFL like it's the preseason, which I thought was an outlandish statement to make, but some people were saying that because, we didn't really know what to expect from these teams. So I think that's an excellent point on your part. And like you said, I mean, nobody ever loses nobody ever loses in this business.
Yeah,
you scroll through social media, everyone's 70%, everyone's got a beach house, everybody's got, a vacation home somewhere. Nobody ever loses in this business. Yeah. So, that's the thing. The NFL market is rough, and a lot of people did well last week, and you sort of wonder, if there is sort of that regression to the mean here this week. The only thing I can think of that people lost last week was there was some sharper money on Indianapolis expecting that blowout over the Jaguars. And by the box score, Indy did blow them out. Yep. The result just didn't follow suit. So even that loss, people are going to say right side, wrong result. So, everybody's a winner last week, and we'll see what happens here this week, I guess.
I did have a loser, advantage teaser on the Colts. Can you believe that? They couldn't even cover an advantage teaser with that box score.
I know. I had one too. I think I had Packers and Colts. And the Packers just go ahead and win out. Yeah.
That was my teaser. My advantage teaser play of the week. That was the only thing I lost.
Those advantage teasers. I mean, look, I know that they're long-term proven successful. I feel like I've lost more of them than I've won.
I won for 3 years straight playing them. Now, a year plus, I haven't won. It's been very frustrating.
Yeah. There's always something that's frustrating about the NFL market, to say the least here. But we got a highlight clip here of game 283-284, Baltimore and Houston. Baltimore up to 7-point favorites in this one. Total coming down a little bit, interestingly enough, 51.5. Baltimore looks great against the Browns. The Browns are never prepared for Week 1, and Baltimore was very prepared for Week 1. Lamar Jackson found every open receiver, and he had plenty of them because the Browns' major injury concerns in the back seven. Houston, they probably played okay, I would say, against the Chiefs, but again, a Chiefs team that is probably number 2 in everybody's AFC power ratings, just below the Baltimore Ravens. Pretty brutal start to the season for Houston, having to play, the Chiefs and the Ravens back to back. What do you think about them getting 7 at home here?
So typically, I think in a normal NFL season, I'd probably be all over the Texans here. They were beat by double digits on national TV, got an extra couple days to prepare, taking on a Ravens team that had one of the dominant, if not the most dominant performance from Week 1. To me, it'd be a typical auto play on the Texans. Some of it, though, I think some of the college game is creeping in the NFL where teams, we talk about parity in the NFL where the power rankings difference between 1 through 16, 1 through 32 is just not that disparate. Any little half-point edge you can get is worth betting as far as I'm concerned. But I just think maybe the Chiefs and the Ravens are just that much better than everybody else. We certainly saw it when the Ravens played the Texans last year. They absolutely dismantled them, 41-7. Box score agreed with it. It was an absolute ass kicking for the Ravens. And Ravens, to me, have the best roster. To me, I still have the Chiefs number 1 in my power rating because the head coach, well, Harbaugh's a pretty good head coach too, but Reed and Mahomes put them over the top. But the Ravens are real close there. And I don't trust Bill O'Brien. And I like Deshaun Watson. but that offensive line looked better at times last week, but still in the end, I just don't know if they got enough to compete here with the Ravens. Lean Baltimore for me, but typically it would have probably made my card last 5 years Texans plus the full touchdown at home.
Well, and that's why I wanted to talk about this game specifically. And I know it's a highlight video. I know people want picks, but I'm more about the process. I'm more about the philosophy of handicapping as opposed to just sitting here handing out picks left and right. And that's just it. Traditionally speaking, this is a play on the Texans. For you, for me, it's a contrarian handicap. A lot of people on Baltimore this week. We see that with the line going up. And you got the Bill O'Brien factor. And that's the hard part here, is that he is at such a dramatic disadvantage against a head coach like John Harbaugh. We talked earlier in the show about how to handicap and how to quantify college coaches and all that, and how there are some very big gaps with college football. For the most part in the NFL, the gaps aren't that large, and then you get a Bill O'Brien, and you get a Bill O'Brien against a John Harbaugh. That's problematic to me. I do think it was easy for Baltimore to look really good against Cleveland because they know the personnel, they know the weaknesses, they knew they could attack that secondary, and they attacked it very, very effectively and very efficiently. This week against Houston, does Houston's secondary play a little bit better? Probably can't play worse than the Browns secondary did last week, but is Houston able to do anything offensively to keep pace if they need to? And I don't know the answer to that question. Last week, Will Fuller was very, very busy, but we saw that Houston has had to change their offense without DeAndre Hopkins. And, you sort of wonder here in week 2, like we just talked about with the week 1 to week 2 overreaction, thoughts and theories here. How much changes for Houston from week 1 to week 2? Nothing needs to change for Baltimore. Nothing really ever needs to change for Baltimore. Does Houston adjust and doesn't allow them to stick around in this game? I don't know if I can trust Bill O'Brien to do that. I don't know if I can trust the Texans offensive line to give Watson time to develop a rapport with somebody other than Will Fuller.
Exactly. I way too much uncertainty on the Houston side. What I do have certainty is, at least to start off a season, Harbaugh is money, whether it's preseason games, season openers, his trends are really good. I mean, that guy, we got a sample size now of decade plus. His teams are ready to go at the start of the season. We even saw last year how dominant they were to start it off. Again, I'm not typically, I would want to take the home dog, getting the full touchdown here, a playoff type of caliber team with a decent quarterback in Deshaun Watson. No. And to me, the edge isn't there enough. Way too much uncertainty with Bill O'Brien.
So here's a question, and this is something that we'll talk about more as we go throughout the season here. We mentioned this a little bit in passing last week. For most NFL seasons, it's Las Vegas and it's the offshore market. But for this NFL season, we've got a lot of states on board now, to the point where I would assume that we have, a much more public sentiment out there to bet on teams like the Ravens. And so far, we have seen that here. Do you think that maybe this is a game that gets to 7.5? Maybe a rogue hook pops up here somewhere. And at that point, would you take the Texans?
And leading Texans. Again, NFL, every half point matters. That's what I'll preach. And I'll preach for most cases, even this year. But when it comes to the Ravens and the Chiefs specifically, because two teams that have quarterbacks, unique quarterbacks. Mahomes might be the most gifted arm talent we've ever seen in the history of the NFL. Lamar Jackson, we've never seen anything like him. I'm not sure the point spreads can necessarily account for some of these guys. I mean, outside of Baltimore's horrible performance in the playoffs, this team is just crushing teams. We thought they had a historically great team last year until the playoffs. Well, I'll tell you, the Chiefs are on a historic run, 10 straight wins, 10 straight covers. Typically the market accounts for this. I'm not sure that it does. So, I would normally run the window and say, give me Texans plus 7.5. I'm telling the edge here, and it's more of an in-game live wagering opportunity for me. Either it's going to be a very competitive game right down to the fourth quarter, or it's going to be evident early that, hey, the Texans don't have an answer for this Lamar Jackson-led Baltimore offense, and we're going to see what we saw last year, Baltimore crushing the Texans. So in-game live would be the way I'm going to go, even if it moves a half point.
Yeah, that Kansas City line just going north here as well this week, up from 6.5, 7 to 8.5. And you bring up a good point about live betting. I think when we circle back next week on Thursday, we'll do a highlight video here for our ATS YouTube page on live betting, some of the things that you want to look for, both in college football and in the NFL. But make sure you listen to our editions of ATS.io radio. We got a lot of good stuff going on there with those. My apologies for the camera as my monitor decided to shut off on me. So that's a good way to end this highlight video, I guess, for the ATS.io YouTube page. Fuck it, whatever. All right. So with that, a few other things I want to talk about here with regards to the NFL card for week 2. Any other games that, stand out that we didn't touch on? Maybe the new hometown Las Vegas Raiders, something you want to take a look at?
Yeah, another thing where I'll tell you, I'm not anxious to bet on the Raiders just because I think they're expensive in town. We saw them take a lot of action last week against Carolina and all those people that won, even though I didn't think the Raiders looked very impressive. This would have been the one instance where I wanted to play on Las Vegas. Opening up the stadium, if they would have had, a sellout crowd, it would have been one of the best atmospheres probably in this entire NFL season. Wanted to play the Raiders, but no fans opening up a stadium. I mean, I just lean Las Vegas at this point. If the number continues to climb, though, I wouldn't mind taking them here because, Gruden's a rah-rah type of guy. I wasn't overly impressed with Drew Brees' performance. Tom Brady took the brunt of the criticism and deservedly so after last week's game. But I wasn't impressed with Brees. Raiders, small lean there. And I apologize for not a lot of strong picks in the NFL this week. To me, the card was blah.
Yeah, I don't see a whole lot to love on the card here either. And I figure on that note, with the technical issues that we're having here all of a sudden, with the fact that my webcam just doesn't want to sit where it's supposed to, feels like that's a pretty good way to wrap up this edition here of ATS.io radio. Brad Powers, professional handicapper over at bradpowersports.com. What's going on over at the website right now, man?
Yeah, I talk about it each and every week. It's my newsletter. Game write-up every single college game, game write-up NFL, power ratings for every college team that's playing. We'll add teams as they join the college football season, trends, notes from last week, misleading finals, everything and a whole lot more, including picks. We haven't lost one yet this year. We're perfect so far, college and NFL. Don't buy it for the picks, though. Buy it for the info. $79. It's for the entire season, college, pro. And if the Mountain West and MAC want to play in the spring, you're covered for those as well. BradPowersports.com.
Make sure you follow Brad on Twitter at Brad Powers and the number 7. Brad, appreciate your time as always, man. Thank you so much for joining me, and we'll talk with you again next week.
Sounds good, man. Thanks for having me on.
There you go. There's Brad Powers, professional handicapper over at bradpowersports.com. Coming up on Friday on ATS.io radio, just a podcast version here where I give you my thoughts for week 2 in the Circa Sports Million. Off to a 4-0-1 start. Hopefully can continue that here for week 2. That'll do it for me. Thank you so much for listening, everybody, and I will talk to you again tomorrow.